slavery did not start with Islam, nor did it increase with Islam. Now, one could say, how come alcohol was banned a year after Muslims migrated to Medina, but slavery was never totally abolished? In this video, we will dive into it. Welcome to Foundation 33. Prohibiting slavery in the context of 7th century Arabia would have been as useful as prohibiting poverty. It would have reflected a noble ideal, but would be impossible without completely changing the socio-economic system. Alcohol was banned in 20 years through a gradual process. And about slavery, we could say that although it was not abolished, there were systems put in place that would gradually abolish it. There were no prisons back then, so prisoners of war were either killed or taken as slaves. If we take that definition, there's a lot of slaves in the USA.
What are you Jimmy staring at? Back to work! Let's go, work!
The prison system forcibly makes prisoners work, and there are a lot of stories about abuse in the prison complex. In Islam, the freeing of slaves is encouraged in an act of benevolence and forgiveness for sins like killing another person on accident and promising on God and breaking that promise. Islam also prohibited the gathering of slaves from anywhere but wars against Muslims. For example, during the Badr War, which was the first battle that Muslims participated in to defend their homes, the prisoners of war were asked to pay ransom. The people who were not able to pay ransom were able to go free by teaching 10 Muslims how to read and write. Enslavement was offered as an alternative to killing prisoners of war like the Meccans did against Muslims. This was also done because they are prisoners of war, and letting them go would just add another soldier to the opposition and would weaken the Muslim side. Who's gonna feed them and take care of them? The government didn't have prisons, so the best alternative was enslavement. Another way for a person to be legally a slave in Islam is for them to be born to an unbroken chain of descendants of slaves whose ancestors fought against Muslims and got captured and enslaved. This is very unlikely because of the systems put in by Islam. Also, if someone who fought against Muslims was to be captured but they converted to Islam, they wouldn't be enslaved. In practice, it seems virtually impossible that there will ever be another lawfully declared jihad, especially in the West, because we can freely practice our religion here. So yes, Islamic law dictates that there should be no slaves in the modern world. Side note about US history, the Civil War was fought about the right to own slaves. More than 500,000 people died. There were other forms of persecution after the Civil War, like sharecropping, Jim Crow laws, separate but equal clause, grandfather clause, and such. So abolishing slavery at once is a worse alternative to first eradicating racism, giving them humane conditions, and gradually freeing all the slaves. Before the death of the Prophet, there was a large Muslim army raised, and the Prophet appointed the son of a former slave to the head of the army. In the Quran, a verse states that a slave can talk with his or her master and negotiate a written deed like a fixed amount that if he were to give to the master, he would be free. And after the negotiation, the master has to free the slave. Whenever he gets that much money, the slave is allowed to work and even bring up a family during that time. This request was not to be refused if the slave had good character and the request was genuine. Not only that, but the master is directed to help out of his own pocket for the slave's freedom. Also, liberating a slave is considered zakat, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam that requires giving alms and money to charity and such. On top of encouraging humane treatment, the Prophet said, "Whoever kills his slave, we will kill him. Whoever mutilates his slave, we will mutilate him. And whoever castrates his slave, we will castrate him." Islam also has other principles that elevate the status of a slave. According to BBC, slaves may take legal action and they may be freed as a result of a breach. Slaves have the right to own property, own slaves, get married with the consent of the owner, undertake business on the owner's behalf, and slaves guilty of a crime are punished with half of what a free man would get. Also, a female slave cannot be separated from her child, and special care was given, and sometimes government funds were used so that families are not broken up. Female slaves cannot be forced into prostitution. The following hadith shows that slavery back then is not like 19th century cotton farm slavery in the USA. Allah has put them in your care. So feed them with what you eat, clothe them with what you wear, and do not burden them beyond their capacities. But if you burden them with an unbearable burden, help them by sharing their extra burden. It was not like chattel slavery in the USA, and there were slaves of many different races. So it was not based mainly on racism too. Islam also brought to the Arabian Peninsula a presumption of so a free man cannot be captured and made into a slave. On a side note, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was anti-racist. He even condemned racial slurs when one of his closest companions used it. The view of Islam towards slaves was very radical at the time, considering that the same views only started to be accepted in the West 1,000 years later. There are people who act against their religion in every religion. Some Muslims have done terrible things regarding slavery and slave trade. That does not detract from the message of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the Holy Quran. I want to end with two stories from two beloved caliphs, which means head of state of the Islamic State. Osman, may Allah be pleased with him, punished his slave physically by pulling on the slave's ear, and in return he let the slave pull on his ear in front of the public. Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, was going to Jerusalem because the Muslim army had already conquered Jerusalem, and on his way there he had only one working animal for transportation, and he had his slave with him, and they took turns walking to Jerusalem. That was the respect they had against even slaves, and Islam prohibits slavery in the modern world.